It's the real news. I'm Aaron Mate. U.S. officials have repeatedly touted the bombing campaign against ISIS in Syria and Iraq as the most precise in history.
We're conducting the most precise air campaign in history, and we're able to attrit Daesh and its capabilities anytime and anywhere.
I would argue that this is, I believe, the most precise campaign in the history of warfare. And we have gone to extraordinary measures to safeguard civilian lives.
This has been the most precise air campaign in history. I mean, I think it'll be studied in the future and people will repeat the most precise air campaign in history. And all of our airstrikes go through a common structure in terms of validating the targets. And it is really moving at an incredible clip.
Well, a new investigation tells a very different story. The journalists Azmat Khan and Anand Gopal spent 18 months reporting on the civilian death toll from U.S. airstrikes in Iraq. And they found that the actual toll is at least 31 times higher than U.S. officials have acknowledged. The story in the New York Times Magazine is called The Uncounted, and I'm joined now by one of its co-authors, Anand Gopal, journalist, author of the book, No Good Men Among the Living. Anand, welcome. Let's start with the toll itself. The U.S. number that we've been given in Iraq is 89 deaths of civilians in 14,000 strikes. How did you find a number that is at least a few thousand more than that?
Well, we decided to try to see how this number looks on the ground by going to as many airstrike sites as possible. We picked 3 different parts of the country which were, broadly speaking, representative of the types of places that ISIS had controlled. So, more of a major urban center. So we picked a neighborhood in Mosul, we picked a small provincial town, and we picked a place that was largely abandoned. And overall, we visited 103 airstrike sites and went to each one and tried to determine who was killed, who was targeted, and what were the consequences of it.
And what did you find?
Well, we found that, in fact, 1 in 5 of the airstrikes that we investigated had caused civilian deaths. And in some towns, for example, the town of Kayara, over 2 years, 43 civilians were killed in 40 strikes overall. In that same period, ISIS had executed 18 civilians. So, in fact, in some places, the U.S. led coalitions actually killed more civilians than ISIS.
Right. And so what accounts for the discrepancy between the official figure and the actual figure that you were able to find, which probably, as you suggest in your piece, is even an undercount so far?
Yeah, when the coalition admits to a civilian death, it happens after an sort of extraordinarily high threshold in which somebody has to prove that they're a civilian. Most of the reports that end up getting acknowledged as civilian deaths come actually internally generated from the coalition itself. For example, a pilot drops a bomb, and after he drops the bomb, he sees a civilian vehicle enter the aperture. That's how most of the reporting gets done, and so, as you might guess, very rarely do they actually find cases where they've killed civilians because they're looking at this from an altitude. When human rights organizations or media groups bring allegations to the coalition, they're almost always dismissed. And the coalition usually says, oh, we didn't conduct any operations in that area, we didn't have any aircraft flying in that area. So what we did is go on the ground and actually try to talk to the victims, talk to the survivors, and that's what told such a different story.
Right, and one of those victims is a man named Basim Razo. Can you tell us his story?
Yeah, Basim he's an engineer, and he actually lived in the US. He lived in Michigan with his wife Mayada for a number of years. He moved back to Iraq in the late 80s, and he witnessed his country, a country that he remembered as being a very kind of middle-class, wealthy place, really be destroyed, first by UN sanctions, then by the U.S. occupation of the country in 2003, and then by the rise of ISIS. He was living in ISIS-occupied Mosul for 2 years, and one night he went to bed and around 1:30 in the morning, and he woke up to loud, terrifying noises, and he looked up and he saw that part of his roof was missing, and he looked to his left at where his wife was sleeping, and it was just a pile of rubble, and he started screaming. It turned out it was an American airstrike which killed his wife and his daughter, and it struck the home next door, which was owned by his brother. His brother was killed and his nephew was killed. And shortly after that happened, the coalition actually uploaded a video onto YouTube, which showed a film of the strike, filmed from above. But the coalition claimed that this was the attack was on a IED facility, a car bomb facility, and it actually took Bassem almost 2 years to get the coalition to admit that they actually killed civilians.
So now you profile Bassem and you follow him as he tries to get accountability for what happened to him and his family. Can you tell us about the process that he had to go through?
In many ways, Bassem was quite unique because he lived in the United States and he had a lot of American friends, and he speaks English fluently. So he was able to reach out to them, and they helped him get in touch with the U.S. Embassy in Iraq. And so he had a meeting with the embassy and tried to present his case, saying that his house had been bombed, his family had been killed. But he was basically stonewalled at every step of the way. He was ignored. He sent multiple emails, and he more or less got nowhere with it for over a year. It's only when me and my reporting partner, Azmat Khan, when we got involved, did the coalition begin to respond, because I think the fact that there were journalists on the case, I think, made it difficult for them to ignore, whereas for an Iraqi, it was very easy for them to ignore an Iraqi. And so we sent the coalition evidence, we sent them the videos, we sent them satellite imagery, a whole host of other things. It's only after that process, and even then, after dozens and dozens of emails and back and forth, did they finally accept that they killed his family.
Right, and you accompanied him when he met in person with some U.S. military officials, where they offered him a condolence payment. The figure is $15,000, if I have that right. How does that compare to, I mean, putting aside the fact that he lost his wife and child and other members of his family, just even the value of his home, comparing that to what he was actually offered?
Yeah, I mean, if you add up the material losses, it was something like $500,000 or $600,000. He had a pretty large house. He lived in a really nice part of Mosul, and this offer that they gave came after 2 years, and it was in fact the first offer for anybody in Iraq or Syria who had lost a loved one. They made one other offer a year before for an Iraqi whose car was destroyed. They have not made a single offer for human life. And he went into the meeting and was expecting to somehow recover his material losses. He also didn't have a job anymore. His injuries made it difficult for him to work. So the financial aspect was really important. And they offered $15,000, which he turned down because he found it to be an insult. And he told me after that it was shocking to him that this is how much an Iraqi life was worth to the U.S.-led coalition.
Yeah, and so your impression just from touring on the ground and hearing from people, hearing their stories, comparing their reality to the way in which that bombing campaign was reported, especially by the military, claiming that this is the most precise campaign in history. Can you talk about your takeaways in terms of your impressions of U.S. military's regard for Iraqi civilian life?
Yeah, they use precise in a very particular way. I mean, on the one hand, it is extremely precise in that the bombs often don't miss. So when they're hitting something, they mean to hit it. And when they destroyed Bassem's home, they meant to destroy that facility. So in that sense, it is precise, but it's not accurate because, in fact, there's so much flawed intelligence that goes into these strikes. In fact, we kind of tried to understand among these 103 airstrikes, some of the reasons why civilians were killed. And what we found in many cases was actually poor or outdated intelligence. And this is something that's actually fairly easily fixable if the coalition actually would look at the processes through which they use to make judgments, look at the intelligence thresholds. But they never do that. In fact, they don't actually do their due diligence at all. And I think that shows that there's a blatant disregard, in fact, for Iraqi life. And ultimately, at the end of the day, Iraqis are left to have to prove that they're not ISIS. It's not the other way around. Basically, people are guilty until proven innocent.
In the case of Bassem, his house was initially deemed to be some sort of weapons depot, right, by ISIS?
A car bomb factory, in fact.
A car bomb factory.
And, yeah. And later, first they said it was a car bomb factory on the video, and internally they said it was an ISIS headquarters. So even among themselves, they couldn't even agree on what they were striking.
And one of the most striking things is that he repeatedly pleaded for a letter, just some acknowledgement from the U.S. military, just to certify that he's not actually a member of ISIS, because the impression that he was in being bombed put him in danger. How long did it take for him to get actually even that acknowledgement?
He still hasn't gotten a letter. He's been promised a letter multiple times. In the meeting that I went in with him to get where he was offered the payment, he asked them for something in writing that could attest to his innocence, and they said they would do it. He also asked them to please call the Iraqi security forces, the Iraqi army, and ask them not to target his house after Mosul was recaptured from ISIS, and they promised to do that. But neither of those things have happened. In fact, his house has been ransacked by the Iraqi army after ISIS was kicked out. I think the building which housed the pharmacy that he owned was attacked and bombed. He's afraid to go back to what considered liberated Mosul. He's afraid to go back to Mosul because on the ground, the security forces, the militias, all they see is a bombed house, and they assume, well, if this house was struck by the Americans who are our allies here, this guy must be ISIS. So he's terrified, and he thinks he can never go back to Mosul, and he's still waiting for a letter from the Americans.
And then finally, were there other options in terms of just from the goal of uprooting ISIS from Mosul? Were there other options to this, massive and devastating bombing campaign that killed so many people?
Well, there were a few political choices that are made along the way that I think really changed the death toll and made it much, much worse. And I'll give you a couple of examples. One was a change made under the Obama administration in December, which made it easier for frontline commanders to call on airstrikes. And what the effect of this was is that you had a lot of people who are in the thick of the battle calling in strikes in cases where, for example, there was an ISIS sniper on the roof of a house, and there were a dozen family members trapped under the house, and somebody would call in an airstrike and bomb the house just to kill the sniper, and it also killed 12 to 15 civilians. This kind of story was happening again and again. A second choice that was made was that in the battle for Mosul itself, there was a political decision made to encircle Mosul and not allow an exit corridor for ISIS fighters or even initially for civilians. Whereas the U.S. and the Iraqi government had done so in previous battles, like the battle for Fallujah. They actually allowed an exit corridor for ISIS fighters. And when the fighters left the city, the U.S.-backed forces fought them in the desert, and the city itself was mostly spared. In Mosul, there was a decision to annihilate ISIS, even if that meant killing tens of thousands of civilians. And so that was a political decision that was made, and it stems from decisions made under the Obama administration. And that's really why we see the death toll being what it is.
The piece, the must-read piece in the New York Times is called The Uncounted, written by Azmat Khan and my guest, Anand Gopal. Anand is the author of the book, No Good Men Among the Living. Anand, thank you.
Thanks so much.
And thank you for joining us on The Real News.